Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. Stephen Williams, who at one time was the Junior Minister in the Department for Communities and Local Government. Yes, Mr. Williams.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Good morning, members of the panel. I now call Mr. Stephen Williams, please.
Good morning, Mr. Williams.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to affirm.
Yes.
And the words should be there on the screen in front of you. Would you read them out, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Would you like to sit down, please, and make yourself comfortable? All right. Yes, Mr. Mate.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williams, good morning.
Good morning.
Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to this inquiry and assisting us with our investigations? We're extremely grateful to you. If you have any difficulty understanding any of my questions, or you would like me to repeat them, then I can do that, or I can put the question in a different way. Can I also ask you, please, to keep your voice up and to speak slowly so that the transcriber who sits to your right can get down everything you say in a nice, clear way. Please also don't nod or shake your head. You have to say yes or no, otherwise it doesn't come out on the transcript. We're going to take the usual scheduled breaks that we normally take during the course of the day, but of course if you need a break at any other time, then just let us know and we can do that.
Mr. Millett, I'm sorry to interrupt you at such an early point, but I think that the transcript on view in the room is not running. It may just need refreshing, as mine did.
Right. I think
it's up there now.
It's up now, I think.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Now, Mr. Williams, you've provided two witness statements to the inquiry. I'd like to put them to you if I can. Your first statement is CLG 3030872. And that's the first page, dated the 22nd of April. Could you please go to page 22? And you can see a signature there above your name under the statement of truth at the foot of page 21. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Have you read this statement recently?
Yes, I wrote both my statements again over the weekend.
Right. Can you confirm that the contents of this statement I'm putting to you are true?
I can.
Now, your second statement is at CLG 3034291. And that's dated the 12th of July 2021. That's its first page. Can we please go to page 16? And you can see a signature there, just under the statement of truth. Again, is that your signature?
It is.
And can you confirm that the contents of this statement are true?
Yes, I can.
And as you've said, you read it recently. Have you discussed your statements or the evidence that you're going to give today with anybody before coming here?
No one other than the legal team. No.
Right. Now, I'm going to start by asking you some brief questions about your background. I think it's right that before you came into politics, you were a tax consultant.
That's correct, yes.
And you were elected to the Avon County Council in 1993, yes?
Yes.
Bristol City Council in 1995.
Yes.
And I think you remained a councillor there until 1999.
That's correct, yes.
And then you stood as a Liberal Democrat candidate and you gained Bristol South in 2005.
Bristol West, actually.
Bristol West, and held various roles until you were appointed Parliamentary Under-Secretary.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was at the DCLG in October 2013.
That's correct.
7th of October 2013, I think. And is it right that you held that position until the 8th of May 2015?
Yes. I lost my seat at the general election and all Liberal Democrat ministers resigned en bloc on that day.
Yes. Are you still a member of the Liberal Democrat Party?
I am, but I'm no longer actively involved in politics, and obviously, as you just said, effectively I've been out of office for almost 7 years now.
Right. Now, I'd like to turn then to the department and the building regulations and how the two related to each other. Can we start, please, with your first statement? Go back to that, CLG 3030872, page 2, paragraph 4. You say there, I was Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government from 7th of October 2013 to 8th of May 2015. The ministerial team at DCLG was led by the Secretary of State, who was Eric Pickles MP. The permanent secretary was Bob Kerslake, and from 1st of March 2015, Melanie Dawes. How closely did you work with the then Secretary of State, Eric Pickles, in that period between October 13 and May 15?
Well, this may surprise you, but we'd never actually met before I was appointed, and I knew lots of Conservative MPs. Obviously, I've been an MP for 8 years by that point, but we'd never met before. So obviously there was an initial getting to know each other, sort of a part to the role. Much to my surprise, we got on better than I thought we would. Obviously, we're quite different personalities and quite different values, but we certainly got on quite well for the almost 2 years I was there. We met formally every Wednesday morning. The civil service has something, or departments have something called prayers, where the ministerial team, the permanent secretary, all the director generals, and other senior officials all meet together in the large meeting room in the department, 8 o'clock every Wednesday morning. And I used to sit next to Eric so that we could confer with each other about things that we were discussing about what was going to be happening that week. So we saw each other formally every single Wednesday when Parliament was sitting. If I wanted to, or if he wanted to, we saw each other informally as well. But we couldn't just walk into each other's offices. Civil service is very structured and hierarchical, so we had to be walked by our private secretaries from one office to the other and escorted back. It was a very strange arrangement, but there we are. So,
right.
Yeah, so we had plenty of time together.
Right. And what about the permanent secretary, Bob Kerslake, and then from 2015, Melanie Dawes? How closely did you work with them?
Not so much with Bob Kerslake. That wasn't because I didn't want to or he didn't want to. He was also head of the Home Civil Service. So in practice, I think he spent quite a lot of time away from the department. The deputy permanent secretary, Helen Daniels, I think from memory, certainly Helen something, her name was the person who I suppose really ran the department, and I met with her on a regular basis, both formally and informally, as the only Liberal minister in the department. I think she was there to look after me, as it were.
Right, okay.
And Melanie Dawes, as you can see from the date, I'm not sure we ever even met, because she effectively started 3 weeks before the general election. So.
And in general, can you remember, what were the main priorities for the department during your time as Parliamentary Under-Secretary?
You mean the department in a wider sense, or my responsibility?
The department in a wider sense.
Well, I suppose one of the biggest issues was this was what would now be called the age of austerity. The department had taken a heck of a whack in the first comprehensive spending review of the coalition in 2010. I think, from memory, probably took the biggest hit of any department. I mean, the coalition took the decision to protect the NHS, school spending, police spending, and so on, and of course, DWP spending. Those are all the big spending departments. Then you're left with smaller departments that disproportionately took expenditure cuts, including the Ministry of Justice, which is probably of interest to you. So the department had taken quite a big hit in expenditure terms. The Secretary of State, I would say, was quite keen to please the Treasury on that front. So that was one big background issue for local government itself. And obviously, as the Liberal Democrat minister, we still ran in those days lots of councils. A lot of my time was spent with local government colleagues, trying to defend to some extent what the government was doing. But in terms of the department's other priorities, as far as it affected me, so there's a little bit of creative tension there in between two parties who were in government together for the first time. So I wanted to make sure that the department dealt seriously with climate change. When Nick Clegg appointed me to the role, there wasn't much of a pep talk or handover, but he said the one thing I want you to deliver is zero carbon homes in order to affect climate change and reduce people's home energy bills. So that was my main priority while I was a minister, but lots of other things cropped up both proactively and reactively while I was there.
Thank you. Now let's go to page 2 of your statement, paragraph 6 at the bottom, and over to page 3. You say, as a minister, I was nominally responsible for the following policy areas at DCLG. A, integration and race equality. B, localism, decentralisation and community rights. C, building regulations and standards. D, empty homes. And E, climate change and sustainable development. It is, however, important to understand that MHCLG is a very large government department covering a wide range of policy areas, and as the only Liberal Democrat minister in the department as part of the coalition government, I was expected to have a degree of oversight of everything the department was doing. To that extent, my box was probably larger than that of other junior ministers in the department at the time. Now, you say nominally responsible for the identified policy areas. What do you mean by that, by nominally responsible?
The honest answer, I don't know why that word is there. Now, I was responsible.
Right.
Those were in my portfolio. I suppose the only reason nominally might have been put in there was, of course, the Secretary of State is also responsible for all of those areas. As I said, I've reread these statements over the weekend. There is actually an omission there. There should be an F. I was also responsible for local economic development, local enterprise partnerships, and was Vice Chair of the Cabinet Committee on Local Economy. So
Right.
there was a sixth direct responsibility.
Okay.
But I also, as I say here, had to keep an eye on what the blue side of the coalition was doing as well. And so the word probably in the bit about my box is superfluous, really. It certainly was large.
Right. Did the other junior ministers have any responsibility for the building regulations, or was it just you?
I think officially it was just me. Also, the Secretary of State would have been responsible. There would have been some crossover with the Fire Minister. And I know because I watched last week, you've already interviewed former colleague Brandon Lewis. There was a second Fire Minister halfway through my time in office, Penny Mordaunt, as well. So they would have had some role in that. And other departments took an interest. You may come on to it, but during the Housing Standards Review, several other departments took an interest in what we were doing at the time.
And how did you manage to stay on top of such a broad and wide-ranging portfolio?
By having 5 or 6 hours sleep a night.
Right.
I mean, quite often I would start the day straight after breakfast and would be working until 1 o'clock the next morning.
And were these topics, the 5 you've listed and indeed the 6th you've added, typical of the range and breadth of topics which a parliamentary undersecretary in that government had to deal with?
Well, yes and no, and I'll explain that. Yes for Liberal Democrat ministers, no for Conservative ministers.
Right.
I mean, the balance of ministers in that government was obviously on the same ratio as members of Parliament that made up the coalition parties. So I think from memory there were 15 Liberal Democrat ministers. We didn't have a minister in every department, but where we did have a minister, we often had heavy responsibilities. I think that was done deliberately to give us a flavour of everything that the department did. But we all also had to keep an eye as far as we could on what our Conservative coalition colleagues were doing.
And did that context that you've just explained to us present policy challenges in relation to the issues over which you were expected to have oversight?
Yes, because obviously we were two different parties while we formed a coalition agreement to work together for 5 years. And that's an important point. It was a 5-year policy deal. We had different values and in some cases different priorities to the other side of the coalition. I would say the government was remarkably harmonious for those five years, but there were points of tension, some of which are public and some of which were handled privately.
And were there any points of policy challenge in relation to building regulations and the approved documents?
Yes, I've mentioned zero carbon homes and the Housing Standards Review already. There were certainly tensions in that area. For instance, in the Housing Standards Review, I was determined to reintroduce space standards into the building of houses. Space standards were introduced, I think, by Lloyd George with the Building Research Establishment, Land Home Fit for Heroes, etc., and were abolished by Thatcher. And I wanted to bring them back, and there was a big campaign to persuade me to do that. That was resisted by the Conservatives, but we prevailed on that, and likewise zero carbon homes, which is something we wanted to do, and they certainly didn't. And after 2015, they suspended the legislation. So those were two big areas of tension.
Right. Now, in the list we looked at, we saw building regulations and standards. How much of your time, and I know it's a broad question, but how much of your time would you say was dedicated to that area of your portfolio?
Well, you can see it's roughly a sixth of the responsibilities, right. And then if you add monitoring the other ministers, and being on cabinet committees that were nothing to do with the department, there were 8 responsibilities. I wouldn't say it was an 8th or a 6th. It's hard to say, but it was definitely a minority, a small minority of the time that I spent every week. But there would have been peaks and troughs. So when we were doing the zero carbon homes legislation, I would easily spend almost an entire week with officials when clauses were being drafted, when we were meeting lobbyists and house builders and so on from outside. So sometimes I would spend days on building regulations, and then there might be a gap of weeks where I might do nothing at all.
Right. And who decided that zero carbon homes and the housing standards review would be the main focus of your time, as it turned out, between 2010 and 2015?
Well, taking climate change seriously and, in particular, reducing sort of energy wastage from people's homes was something that was in the Liberal Democrat manifesto. So that was definitely our priority. And as I said, Nick Clegg, I think the only thing I remember him saying to me was he wanted me to deliver that. And at that point, it hadn't been agreed. There was a battle to come over what was in the final Queen's speech, the 2014 Queen's speech in May 2014, before we secured it. The Housing Standards Review was something that I'd inherited. I would imagine that was probably generated by officials, and something that they wanted to do was a broad-ranging review of what local government did in the area of planning and standards. So as well as covering dimensions of houses, covered home security, flood risk, disabled access, a whole range of issues. It was an enormous piece of work that had started under my predecessor, Don Foster. So I came in sort of midway through to it and had to bring it to a conclusion and make sure it was brought to a conclusion in a way that was, well, liberal, I suppose.
And before you became Parliamentary Under-Secretary, did you have any knowledge about the building regulations and the system of building control?
Not really. I knew there were building regulations, and you mentioned in your introductory questions that I'd been a 3-term local councillor, so obviously I knew that was a function of local authorities, but I knew far less about them than I did about planning and development control. I think politicians get much more involved in that side of things, whereas the regulatory aspects of how you construct something, I'd never really been involved with before.
And were you aware that the building regulations primarily imposed functional or performance-based requirements?
I wouldn't have thought about them in those particular terms, no.
Were you aware?
I just knew they were a guide, a template for developers to use when constructing a building.
Right. Were you aware that they were supplemented by statutory guidance on common building constructions by something called the approved documents?
Well, I wasn't when I was appointed, but obviously over time, from roughly November 2013 onwards, more things were explained to me as things cropped up. So my understanding grew, and I think I'm an intellectually curious sort of person in life in general, but also about the responsibilities I had. Most of the other areas of the portfolio I had a sort of feel for. This I knew nothing about, other than they existed. So I was keen to get an understanding.
Were you provided with any kind of introduction or briefing about the building regulations and the supporting statutory guidance, the approved documents, when you took office?
Yes, in my first probably 5 or 6 weeks, there was a whirlwind of introductory briefings. As you'd expect, being a minister is effectively a different job. You even have a different salary and HR regime as a minister. So there were lots of introductory sessions, and that's my overriding memory of my first couple of months in office, that there was almost a conveyor belt of officials coming to see me, starting with Bob Kerslake and all the deputy permanent secretaries, and then going through each area that I was the minister for, the 6 areas that we've talked about, but also all the other areas as well. So I was comprehensively filled up with information probably in the first 6 weeks.
And did anybody actually sit you down with the building regulations and the approved documents and showed you how they worked?
No. The Director General, who I think was Peter Schofield, he's mentioned in the statement, I think gave me sort of a general view of what they were. And I think later on, I would have met Bob Leadsom and then some of his officials to talk about detailed aspects. We never actually went through any of the documents themselves. I was shown them. They were a lever arch file each, and they were available in the department, and I was shown, that's where they are, and that's how big they are. But I was told, you're not expected to understand them. That's what we're for.
Did you ever come to look at approved document B on fire safety during your time in office?
No.
No. Look at paragraph 13 of your first statement, please, which you'll find on page 4. You say there, in respect of my role in decisions, these were taken in the usual way for a junior minister in a government department. Submissions were prepared by officials and presented to my private office. When my private office thought it appropriate, considering the workload at the time and the priority of the particular submission, it would be placed in my box and I would consider it. Depending on what the submission requested, some submissions would be for information only, for example, and not require a decision. I would either respond requesting further clarification, approve or decline the recommendations, or just note the actions as appropriate. Now, just focusing there on what when you say, when my private office thought it appropriate, in the third line, what does that mean?
Well, there's probably a lot of incoming paperwork into a minister's outer office. Private office is a bit of an odd term, but the outer office of. I had 4 private secretaries who looked after me. One of them was a diary secretary, PA, and then there were 3 private secretaries who specialised in different policy areas for me, and that went right across the department, given my role. They would have selected what was, I suppose, one where I needed to make a decision, and we came upon a scheme where we'd have a colour-coded file every night. A red folder was where I needed to make the decision. A yellow folder was submissions of interest, because they were politically sensitive but were being dealt with by Tory ministers, and the special advisor had some role, which you might want to ask about, had some role in deciding what went into that folder. Then there was a green folder, which was stuff to read if you've got time. To be perfectly honest, I obviously worked through the red folder and the yellow folder. I rarely, unless it was a very long train journey, got to the green folder, but they were all press clippings and things such as that.
Now, red folder, which is the one where where material was placed where you needed to make a decision. Who in your private office was responsible for deciding what should go into the red folder or not the red folder?
The principal private secretary was someone called Kerma Kendrick.
Yes.
So I guess he would have taken those decisions with his 2 assistant private secretary colleagues.
Right. And how did he or they decide when it was appropriate or necessary for you to review particular submissions and make particular decisions?
Well, that I'm not sure I can answer what their thought processes were, but I'm not aware that they received 20 submissions and decided I should only see 15 of them. If they required a decision by me, then all of them would have gone into the red folder. I suppose they may have been a layering of them over time, so that I wasn't presented with 20 submissions on Monday and nothing on Wednesday, for instance. But beyond that, anything that required a decision by me, I would have expected to have gone into the red folder.
Right.
Otherwise, no one could make the decision.
Well, that's what I'm really seeking to understand better. Who decided whether you needed to make a decision?
Well, the submission would be written in that way. I mean, submissions obviously written by the policy officials, the permanent staff in the civil service, and a submission would make it clear what was required, whether the minister was being informed about something, the progress on something, or some development or something, or whether a decision was needed. And I suppose it would say when a decision was needed.
If a submission came into your private office, into Kerma Kendrick's domain and those helping him, would it mean that automatically that submission would find its way into your red box or red folder? Or was there a filtering mechanism whereby Kerma Kendrick or other officials in your private office might decide that you didn't need to make the decision or didn't need to make it now?
I don't think they would have had the authority to say I didn't need to make the decision. If the submission had come from an official saying a minister needs to decide this, and he was addressed to me, I don't see how they could not put it into the red folder. But if I didn't need to make the decision now, then they might hold it back. If I had plenty of other decisions to make, they might save it up for the weekend or something.
Right.
But there were time deadlines for responding to certain things, because it wouldn't just be submissions on policy that would come through. It would be correspondence, which I'm guessing you're going to come to. There would be draft oral question replies. There would be written parliamentary answers. And all of those have a time limit. So I suppose it depended on what was time critical in a given week. But I am supposing, I'm not saying that's necessarily how he decided.
No. Okay. Did anybody in your private office have a detailed knowledge or understanding of the building regulations and the associated guidance?
Kerr had been a minister's private secretary for quite a long time. I'm in danger of getting the number wrong now, but he did joke to me that I think I was minister number 12 or something that he dealt with. He'd been in other departments, but he'd been in that department for a while. And yes, he had a reasonable understanding of building regulations, and certainly knew all the officials who came to see me from time to time. He knew all of those quite well.
Looking at paragraph 15 at the foot of the screen, foot of page 4, you say, as the building regulations and approved documents are very technical, when I was called upon to make decisions in respect of them, I relied upon the advice I was given by officials, most of whom I understood to have been in post in the area for some considerable time, and who had a great deal of experience and subject matter expertise. I had no knowledge of the building regulations or the approved documents prior to joining the department. Is it fair to say, on the basis of what you say here, that you had no knowledge or expertise which could form the basis of a challenge of any officials who did have subject matter expertise?
Well, we live in a parliamentary democracy where ministers are appointed for their general skill set. Ministers may have particular skills and expertise, and I certainly had some, both professionally in tax and the economy, and through parliamentary and local government experience in certain other areas as well. But we don't have a technocratic government in this country. Some other countries do, but we don't. Ministers are there to apply, I guess, political judgment, common sense judgment, what is good for society. And in a technical area, which is what we're concerned with here, I suppose there's less latitude, less room for manoeuvre for a politician to challenge what a technical expert in the official is saying. To some extent, you have to take what they're saying at face value, but that doesn't mean I was a pushover or a rollover for them.
No. How did you ensure, though, given the lack of technical expertise, which, as you say, might come naturally with the way in which government works in this country, but how did you ensure that officials within your department were giving sound advice about, for example, the balance between fire safety on the one hand and economic considerations on the other?
I see what you're saying, but I'm not sure that ministers, to some extent, can second-guess officials if they are an expert on what they're advising you. There are several different types of policy civil servants. There's obviously the fast streamers, which are, I guess we're all familiar with, who move around from function to function, and indeed from department to department. There are people who move around internally inside the department, but aren't fast streamers. But there are some experts, and they might spend 6 months on one area. And that happened to me while I was a minister, that I had met someone previously who was trying to advise me on race equality, and then 6 months later he was trying to explain the local government settlement to me because he'd moved. And that that happened with regularity. The joke that ministers revolve and the civil service is permanent, I don't think is fair or true. But in this area, a technical area, the officials had been in place for some time, and to that extent, yes, they did have an advantage over me. And I watched your evidence session last week with Brian Martin, and you were asking him questions about his time in building control in the 1990s. So he had quite a lot of experience, and I had zero.
Right. Now, if we go to paragraph 11 of your statement, please, top of page 4, first statement, here you are answering a question about who held the key roles in MHCLG in fire safety policy, building regulations, and building regulations technical. And you can you've set out the answer there, and I won't read it out to you, but you identify Peter Schofield, John Bright, Bob Leadsom, Anthony Bird, and Brian Martin. In practice, who was it that you relied on to advise you on the building regulations and associated guidance?
Obviously, there are lots of building regulations. You work your way through the alphabet, and not all letters are used. Principally, it would have been Bob Leadsom, but over time, I came to rely on Richard Harrell, who's mentioned in D, rather more, when he was head of policy and had a way of explaining things to me, almost in layman's terms, I suppose. He was an architect, I think, by practice, and I have an interest in architecture, so we were able to relate to each other. Bob was rather drier, I would say.
And how often would you meet with, first, Bob Leadsom to discuss building control matters, building regulations matters?
I'm not sure there was any routine nature to the times that we met. We only met when we needed to. I met Richard more often, particularly if I had questions when a submission came to me and I wrote in it, needs discussion. It would be Richard who would come and explain something to me.
Right, and that was from January 2013. What about his predecessor?
2014, I think you mean?
2014. What about his predecessor, Anthony Bird?
I don't recall meeting him. I'm not saying I didn't, but obviously that's now quite some time ago, and he was right at the start of the time I was a minister. And I as I've already said, there was a whirlwind of meetings with different people at that time. I'm afraid, no disrespect to Mr. Bird, but I don't recall meeting him.
Were you aware at any time from any of your discussions with either Richard Harrell or Bob Leadsom that officials within the building regulations division in the department didn't think it was part of their task to oversee or review the success of building regulations as a scheme or the building control system?
I'm not sure we ever discussed remits in that sense. I did know, and my understanding grew, that the application of the standards was done at a local level, literally at site level, and was primarily a function of local government, local authority building control inspectors. Sometimes that would be done by private companies engaged by the developer. I didn't know that when I became a minister, but by asking questions, I got to understand that that was the case. And indeed, I met quite a lot of building control people because I was curious to understand more about them. I met with their national association. I think I went to their award ceremony, and I spent a full day in a department with them on a visit, which by coincidence more than anything was in Bristol. And I spoke at their annual conference in Nottingham and spent a full day with them. So I got more over time. I got more of a flavour for what they did, right. And yes, indeed, the monitoring what people do on the ground was a function of local government, not central government. So I guess central government made the policy parameters, but monitoring adherence to them was a responsibility discharged somewhere else.
Right. You say their national association. What was its name?
I think it was the from memory, it was the LABC.
LABC. Who did you meet at the LABC? Do you remember?
I can visualise him. I can't remember his name.
I'm not sure that'll.
No, I know. I'll say it just to be helpful to you. He was a man who had a profound physical disability. Everyone in building control will know who I'm talking about. I'm afraid I can't. Right. I've got memory lapse. I can't remember his name.
That's okay. And do you remember the year when you made your visit and gave your speech presentation?
Well, so I met him several times at various events. It would have been throughout probably the second half of 2014.
And what was the topic of your address to the LABC?
You're asking me, can I remember the contents of a speech I made 8 years ago? Bear in mind, I made lots of speeches.
The title may help.
I can't even remember the title. One of the pain barriers I had to go through as a minister was that speeches were written for me, whereas up until 2013, I'd been responsible for my own speeches and tend not to use notes. So if I do, they've just got bullet points. I didn't have a massive research team behind me as an opposition politician or as a spokesman within the Liberal Democrat side of the coalition between 2010 and 2013. So I was used to writing my own things, knowing what I thought and extemporising. As a minister, you have to read the line, both when answering questions and when making speeches, and I absolutely hated that. So whatever it was, I read it out. I do remember sort of drying up a bit because I was probably bored with reading it out, and then extemporising. But that's all I can remember about the occasion. So this is a speech 8 years ago.
No, of course. Now, whose responsibility did you understand that it was within the building regulations team to keep up to date with current issues in the construction and housing industry?
Within the building regulations team?
Yes.
I'm not sure I would have known at the time which individual was responsible for keeping up to date with what was going on the ground. I mean, Richard Harold, as I said here, was head of technical policy, and I believe, I think he was an architect, would have been able to understand developments in that field. As to how other people in the building regulations team kept up to date, CPD, as you and I would call it, I really don't know. But to some extent, why should I?
Well, okay. Did you ever challenge any of these officials' advice in respect of building control matters or building regulations matters?
I don't think there was any conflict between us. I mean, broadly, some of the things that I wanted to do, they were supportive of. So, they were supportive of getting a space standard reintroduced into the Housing Standards Review. And the officials generally were minded to help me on doing something about climate change. So actually, we probably agreed on quite a few things.
My question isn't about challenge in the sense of oppose, but challenge in the sense of scrutinise, interrogate, examine closely.
Yeah. Whenever someone came to see me in my office, I would frequently bombard them with questions.
Right. Did you ever examine the line management system to satisfy yourself that the junior officials were being adequately supervised by the more senior?
No, absolutely not. That's not the job of a minister.
Right. Whose job was it?
That job would have been, Peter Schofield, the official identified under A, and I guess he would have been responsible to the Deputy Permanent Secretary. I mean, the career structure within the civil service is quite properly nothing to do with ministers, other than your private office. So my private secretary's changed over the time I was there, and I recruited the replacements. But policy officials, ministers have no role at all on their recruitment or their progression.
And some people listening to this might find what you just said surprising, but...
Well, they shouldn't, because ministers are effective. If the government was a company, then ministers, I suppose, are non-executive directors. They're not, they're not the chief executive and chief finance officer. They're there to lend a common sense and political steer to what officials are doing. They're not necessarily there to make sure that they're professionally competent or generally competent. Yes. For what they're doing. I mean, the civil service is very hierarchical and does have a line management system.
And that, to your understanding, was a constitutional matter, a matter of the structure of government?
I think it is a constitutional matter, yes, that you do have a degree of separation in between the political masters, as it were, and the professional masters within our government. Now,
I'd like to ask you about deregulation and your understanding of the effects that it had on the department during your time as Parliamentary Under-Secretary. Now then, on that subject, do you recall that the one-in, one-out policy, as it became known, is this right, was an administrative policy introduced in 2011 and operated within government whereby, in theory, no new regulation would be introduced without a compensating reduction in regulation being made the other way?
Yes, I was generally aware of that before I became a minister. Obviously, became a little bit more aware of it in practice as a minister. I'm not sure you can describe it in absolute terms as one in, one out in terms of impact. So it's not saying you abolish all fruit and vegetable regulations on one hand and introduce a small regulation on light bulbs on the other hand. I don't think it quite worked like that.
Well, let's see. As a policy, were you a supporter?
Wouldn't say I was keen on it. That would be, I suppose, a bit of tension in between myself in particular, and my Liberal Democrat colleagues in general, and the Conservatives. Governments for quite a long time have used rhetoric about this issue, about bonfire of red tape and all this stuff, going right back to the Thatcher days. I think Michael Heseltine, may have invented that phrase. The Labour government renamed an entire government department to be Business, Enterprise and Regulatory Reform, the one that we now call Business and Energy. So that mantra had been around for quite some time. As to what practical impact it had, I think historians need to adjudicate on that.
Did you have any direct experience yourself when in government of the one in, one out, and later one in, two out policies?
The Housing Standards Review was relevant in that area because there are around about, from memory, 334 housing authorities and therefore planning authorities. In two-tier areas, it would be the district that would be responsible. That's why there's so many of them. And they could have different standards on all sorts of things. So there was a big rationalisation exercise to have some national standards. And so the new space standard that we introduced was a national standard that local authorities could choose to adopt or not. I remember being given some A3 diagram with lots of circles, rather like a very complicated Venn diagram of how different standards and regulations sort of overlap with each other and were different in different places. So there was a rationalisation side to it, which intellectually I could support. But if you're asking, and I guess this is what you really want, was I a deregulatory-minded minister? No, I wasn't.
Right.
I'm a liberal interventionist, and if you obviously have looked a little bit at my background, that is supported by my activities before I became a minister.
Did you think that the one in, one out policy, or latterly the one in, two out policy, applied to fire safety?
I'm not sure I had any opinion on that at the time. It was certainly never expressed to me in those terms. No one ever said to me that in order to introduce something new in fire safety, we have to abolish something in weights and measures or whatever, or indeed the other way around. Because we want to introduce something new in weights and measures, we're going to have to reduce the number of fire extinguishers. Though that conversation never took place. So I never felt that fire safety was being compromised by that one in, one out, or what later became
Right.
One in, two out rule.
Let me just ask you a little bit about the policy before coming back to the question of fire safety. When it doubled to one in, two out, how was the two measured as opposed to the one?
I'm not sure I can answer that because of course, this is a cross-government issue. So DCLG, as it was then, may have wanted to introduce one new regulation, and obviously the space standard was a new regulation. That doesn't mean that DCLG had to surrender to as I understood it, to regulations itself. The surrender of two regulations could have been made by the Ministry of Justice or the Home Office, and there was a cross-government view of that. There was a committee which I did actually go to once. It was the very first thing I did officially as a minister, and I think it's referred to in one of the statements in November 2013. I think it was chaired by Francis Maud, where there were ministers on there from each department, and that's where all this sort of matching up was done.
And to your recollection, was fire safety or health and safety generally a legitimate target of deregulation across government?
Well, the legitimate target is a slightly loaded phrase.
All right, let me try it differently. Was any exemption made for health and safety in general or fire safety in particular from the deregulatory policy so far as you were aware?
As far as I was aware at the time, I'm going to recall now, I don't think there were exemptions, but that, of course, is not to say that if you came to a discussion about what might be given up in return for something new being drawn in, I think I can only speak for myself and possibly my former Liberal colleagues that we would not have accepted watering down of health and safety. I mean, there was a big row about this. I've just remembered something, so thank you for prompting me, over hire and fire. The Tories commissioned someone, I've forgotten his name, to prepare a report saying people can be fired at will. This is just what's just happened to the P&O people. We fought that tooth and nail as something that they wanted to introduce as reducing people's rights. And whether it's health and safety or whether it's employment rights, I think we can put them in the same area. We would have wanted to defend those areas, even if others were not so keen on defending them.
Richard Harold told us in his evidence that the coalition government had adopted a far more rigorous approach to deregulation with increased scrutiny of regulatory proposals. Would you agree with that?
I was aware that there was a more rigorous process. As I said, there was a cabinet subcommittee specifically on it, and I do recall there was also an attempt to make it clearer for people who had to, after all, follow these regulations on the ground in business or in communities. So there would be two common commencement dates, which I think were April the 1st and the 1st of October. So there weren't lots of amendments to different regulations coming out every week throughout the year. There would just be two occasions that regulations would change to give people time to prepare for adhering to those changes. And that, to me, makes sense.
We've seen documents from 2012 which stated, at least to the Star Chamber, as it was called, that the department was a deregulating department. Would you agree with that description from your experience of your time there?
I never heard the department described in those terms myself.
Right. Okay. Were you aware of the pressures civil servants felt to deliver on deregulating policies at the time, and particularly that pressure within the Building Regulations Division?
No. I'd like to think I had a fairly open relationship and candid relationship with my officials, but I don't recall them saying to me, we're under pressure from the other side to deregulate.
Some of the officials giving evidence, Richard Harrell in particular, day 243, page 43, lines 1 to 6, told us that even where there are regulatory proposals which might be superficially attractive, once it was recognised that it was regulation in some way, then they would pull back because it wasn't the way that the government of the day wanted to drive change.
I can see why Richard might say that. It's not for me to preempt what a subsequent witness is going to say to you or what you might ask him, but Eric Pickles certainly often made remarks about regulation. I mean, this is a ridiculous example with hindsight, but we had an almighty fight about the 5p tax on bags. No one now wants to go back to everyone getting new bags when they go shopping. That was a Liberal Democrat initiative. Eric fought that tooth and nail as regulatory madness or whatever. He's a man for colourful phrases. And we had a huge bun fight about it. How much of that was genuine and how much of it was for show, it was for other people to judge.
But in actual terms, was it correct, or were the officials' observations on this correct, that even where there were superficially attractive, perhaps regulatory proposals, that there was an overriding policy against them if they involved new regulation?
It certainly was the case that Eric was sceptical about regulation. As I say, how much of that he genuinely felt, how much of it was trying to please the Treasury, which is something that all ministers have to dance to, the Treasury tune, unfortunately, or the number 10 tune. And if Richard said that to you, and he obviously felt that, then it's not for me to challenge that thought. But I don't recall him saying to me he felt under that pressure. We certainly did have candid discussions, and Eric thought most of the officials were Guardian reading Pinkos.
Right.
So I was more likely to be their ally than he was.
Right.
That's a phrase he would have used, by the way. I didn't make that up.
I mean, did he ever come to you and ask for your help in making regulatory change or clarification even in light of the fact that he'd felt that there was a pressure the other way not to introduce regulation?
I think it was probably Richard who told me about the space standard. I was vaguely aware of this because I'm interested in social policy. I think it was first him that said, look, you've got an opportunity here to introduce a regulation that would be very popular. And so I think he was an architect. The Royal Institution of British Architects had a big campaign on reintroducing a space standard for private sector housing. It still existed in social housing, the Parker Morris standards, they're called if you want to look them up. So I think he was helpful to me in getting a new regulation. So I knew what his mindset was. He was a regulatory person, and so was I. So I suppose he might have thought of me as an ally in that respect. But I generally can't recall him telling me that he felt, or other officials felt, under pressure to deregulate. And I suppose there's a line to which he could walk up to, and that might have been overstepping the remark if he expressed, or anyone else expressed frustration with other government ministers, even though I did encourage officials to be candid with me.
Were you aware that the Building Regulations Department didn't give any consideration to whether any of its work might legitimately be the subject of an exemption from the deregulatory policy?
No.
Can you account for why no exemptions for the life safety parts of the building regulations was even considered at any time by the Building Regulations Division?
I can't, but then I became a minister for the last third roughly of that government, and I guess the parameters of that attitude were decided in 2010, 2011.
Right. Does it surprise you that officials within the Building Regulations Division did not even take any advice on whether, if clarification of the building regulations or statutory guidance documents was all that was needed, the deregulatory policies were engaged?
Well, that's the first I've heard that, so I'm trying to think whether that does surprise me or not. I'd like to think that if those officials felt that they were being put under pressure to dilute health and safety rights and standards, that they would have found a way of resisting it,
right.
Whether resorting to, government lawyers. I mean, obviously, there are internal government lawyers as well as external ones, but I don't know. As I say, a lot of those attitudes would have been baked in the first year of that government, and obviously I was not party to them.
Were you aware that officials in this division were working on the basis that any change to the guidance in the approved documents needed to be the subject of a regulatory impact assessment, because there would be a potential cost to industry, even of just reading whatever was put out by the department?
Well, yes, because I can vaguely recall reading impact assessments of different regulations. And of course, regulations could be on something to do with race equality or homophobia.
No, my question was on the approved document.
Yeah, but the point I'm making is you would expect an impact assessment to be part of the process for introducing new regulation on business or on individuals, whatever it happens to be. It would be rather surprising if you didn't have an economic impact assessment, and you have to, anyway, under statute, have to have a human rights and diversity and equality impact assessment as well.
Did you understand?
And the department had officials who would advise on that because they worked to me.
Did you understand that it was envisaged that the government's deregulatory policies would have an effect on those parts of the building regulations which were concerned with life safety?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yes. Did you understand that? Well, let me put it slightly differently. Did you ever have a concern yourself that the government's wider priority in reducing regulation and red tape had increased competition among regulatory bodies, which led to a focus on cost cutting?
Not entirely sure what you mean by competition amongst regulatory bodies. I mean, certainly in the area of electrical safety, Part P of the building regulations, there were competing commercial regulators, and that's something we did resolve while I was a minister. I mean, it was the main issue that the select committee, the cross-party official select committee, was concerned about in the time that I was a minister, that if you wanted to make sure that you were going to a competent electrician, how could you judge that when there were lots of different authenticating bodies, and they all, for commercial reasons, refused to cooperate. So in the end, I got fed up with this and called them in and told them if they didn't cooperate, we'd make sure they did. So to that extent, yes, I was aware there was some competition, and I don't think it's a good thing. Ultimately, all of these regulations have to help the consumer, have to help the citizen. If the citizen doesn't know how to make sure the regulations are working for their benefit, and if the people who are commercially working in that environment are also not clear, then there's a failure.
And that failure would be a failure of the particular department with responsibility for the regulation, would it?
If the department failed to resolve something that had been brought to its attention, then the obvious answer is yes. But I've just given you an example where something was brought to my attention in the proper way by a select committee, and there was an APBG on home safety as well that was mindful of it. And I think members of Parliament wrote in about it. So we got it sorted, and you can Google it. There's an official launch with me and Clive Betts, who was the chair of the select committee, reintroducing this common electrical safety standard, and you now see it on the side of vans. It's a plug.
What checks and balances? Excuse me. What checks and balances are in place? Excuse me. So far as you understood the position, to ensure that life safety was not unacceptably compromised by these deregulatory policies.
Well, as I think I said to you earlier, I don't recall encountering any area where it was obvious that life safety was at risk because of a deregulatory environment. We were aware of employment rights and other rights and human rights being at risk, and all of that's in the public domain. I wasn't aware of life safety measures necessarily being at risk because of the deregulatory mantra.
Were there any policies in place, either in the department specifically or government more generally, to ensure that the various departments' obligations to safeguard life, including under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, were properly prioritised?
Well, one of the advantages of the coalition government is that it did reintroduce proper cabinet government and government by cabinet committee that I think commentators at the time and historians would certainly say had fallen by the wayside under Blair and Brown, Sofa government and all that. So there were lots of checks and balances in the way that government ran, that any initiative brought forward by a particular department would be subject to what was called, in Whitehall jargon, a right round, right as in written. So if DCLG wanted to do something, if Eric Pickles wanted to do something, I wanted to do something, we couldn't just do it. We'd have to write to the Home Affairs Cabinet Committee, which was chaired by Nick Clegg, and get policy clearance. And it would go round all the sort of domestic departments who could all give their view. So if DCLG had wanted to do something bad in that area, then there were plenty of checks and balances within the system for someone from the Ministry of Justice or from the Home Office or wherever to say no. Right. And of course that was used quite a lot within government to stop nutty stuff from being done.
Right. Lachnal House. Do you recall that was a fire in Southwark in July 2009 in which 6 people died, 3 women and 3 children, which then resulted in an inquest in early 2013?
Are you asking, did I know about it at
I'm really
the time?
reminding you, but I mean, is that something that's familiar to you?
Yes, it's familiar to me. It's probably one of the difficulties with preparing for this session. There are things that are more familiar to me now than they probably were at the time. But
well, let's dive in. Should we go to page 5 of your statement, please, paragraph 16? You say there, the Lachnal House fire occurred on the 3rd of July 2009, and the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations were made on 28th of March 2013, with the Secretary of State's response following thereafter. I was appointed on 7th of October 2013 after these events. As a Minister, I was involved in taking forward actions in response to the Coroner's letter, where related submissions were addressed to me for approval. And then you say this in paragraph 17. I was not aware of the Lachnal House fire before joining the department, and although I cannot recall precisely when, I do remember being told about it at some point by officials, most likely Brian Martin and or Richard Harrell. Was it upon them that you relied for information about the inquest and the actions that you were required to take in response to the recommendations?
yes, so in answer to your initial question, I at the time I was a minister, I was not aware or didn't recall the Lachnal House fire until I was told about it by officials, and that was the reason why the coroner had said what she did, and that's why a review of Part B was a commitment made by the Secretary of State. So I was aware of it as in terms of context as to why Part B needed to be reviewed. I wasn't aware of it in any other way.
Were you aware that Brian Martin gave evidence at the inquest?
No.
Did anybody in the department brief you on the reasons for the external fire spread, particularly downwards fire spread, at Lachnal House?
What I recall is that, as Richard was the person who was best at explaining things to me, that in preparation for the meeting that we had with David Amis and Ronnie King, which I'm sure you're going to come to,
I will.
He drew a diagram for me which explained compartmentation about how the building regulations have been designed for a long time to make sure that fire should not spread from one flat, maisonette, whatever, to another. I don't know whether you're familiar with the game of Jenga, but that's basically what the diagram looked like, interweaving sort of wooden blocks, to explain that the building regulations are designed as such that fire spread should be all but impossible to happen. And that's, of course, is why Lachnal was shocking and why Grenfell was absolutely horrific, because it shouldn't have happened.
Were you ever advised that the fire involved the external panels on the building?
No, we never had a really detailed conversation about what happened at Lachnal House. Apart from I've sort of been prompted to remember because of a submission in 2013 about window installers that it was something to do with defective windows. I think there was a melting from one window down to the flat below.
You were advised of that, were you?
That's my recollection. Right. But that would have been an incredibly brief explanation of what happened.
Were you ever advised about whether the construction, the refurbishment at Lachnal House did comply or didn't comply with the relevant big building regulations and associated guidance?
My recollection was that the contractor had perhaps not adhered to the building regulations as they were at the time, and it was something to do with the competent person scheme for window installers, which I think was the urgent thing the coroner wanted dealt with, and that was dealt with, I think, in November 2013.
Were you ever told anything about National Class Naught, what it was, what it meant, or how it was relevant to flame spread, external flame spread at Lachnal?
No, that is honestly the first time I've ever heard that phrase.
What, today?
Just now, yeah.
Really? Okay. Can we therefore take it that you were not advised or briefed on the fact that back in 1999, a select committee had taken evidence, expert evidence, from industry and others and recommended in a report that external cladding systems either be of non-combustible material or else pass a full system test?
No. Unless someone told me about it, I don't see how I could have been aware of a select committee report in 1999, and I don't recall being told about it. And given that the submissions that I were given are all part of your evidence pack, which we both of us have been through, I couldn't have been aware of it.
Now, let's look at your second statement to the inquiry, please. CLG 3034291, page 3, paragraph 6. You say, I do not believe, although I cannot state with absolute certainty, that I ever read nor was shown HM Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation letter. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I obviously had to think very carefully about that answer when it was put to me in writing, and I honestly don't think I ever saw it, and the paper evidence trail shows that it was never shown to me. So if it wasn't shown to me, then it's a reasonable assumption that I never read it. But that again, Mr. Millett, what you could say, or I could say, why should I have done? Because it had happened, the coroner's letter to the department had happened 6 months before I became a minister. The Secretary of State, so not my predecessor, Don Foster, but or the Fire Minister, Brandon Lewis, had responded himself to it. And it was concluded business to that extent that the coroner had made her findings and her, suggested recommendations. The Secretary of State had responded with what the department was going to do. By the time I became a minister, it was more about let's get on with what we're supposed to do, rather than going over why we'd got to that position. So, no, I didn't read it, but I wasn't given the opportunity to read it either.
Well, given that you were involved in progressing the actions in response to the coroner's letter, Mr. Williams, as you say, how could you possibly have undertaken that task without reading the coroner's recommendations?
Well, because officials are there to advise, and officials... So I was aware of it in the context, obviously. What I'm saying is I never saw a physical copy of the actual letter, so I don't know how long it was, how prescriptive it was, I simply don't know. But I was advised that the coroner recommended that something be done about window installers, and that was addressed quickly, and that there should be a review of Part B, and that the Secretary of State had committed to a review, and that's where this phrase by 2016, 2017, which I know because I've watched previous evidence sessions, you've asked other people about, comes from. So my task as a minister with officials was try to make sure that we met that deadline.
Met that deadline in order to carry into effect the recommendations or not the recommendations?
Well, you're a lawyer, and I think coroners are lawyers, aren't they?
Well, let me ask the question about that.
So there's a jurisdiction issue there, isn't there? That a coroner determines the cause of death.
I'm going to interrupt you.
It's free to make recommendations.
I'm going to interrupt you and ask the question again, because you may have misunderstood it. It may be my fault. You said that your task as a minister with officials was to try to make sure we met that deadline. In meeting the deadline, what was it that you were expecting to do?
I was expecting for what I might call a new Part B, but a revised Part B, a refreshed Part B, an up-to-date Part B, whatever adjective you wish to use, to be in place by 2016, 2017, and whatever I was asked to do as a minister to progress that, to make sure that it was indeed progressed. It is important, though, to say that, given those dates, that it was never going to be me as minister that introduced that new Part B or would be involved in the detailed analysis of it, because the coalition was for a fixed term of 5 years that ended in May 2015. So quite obviously, the detail of what was to come was coming after my time as a minister. But nonetheless, it was my job to do what we could in that period.
Now, looking at that answer, you say, I was expecting for what I might call a new Part B, but a revised Part B, a refreshed Part B, an update Part B. Did you not want to know precisely in what respect the coroner had recommended that Part B be revised or updated?
Well, I was told, I think this is in the documents that you have and I've reread recently, that the Building Research Establishment had been commissioned to look at various work streams that were relevant to the review of Part B, which included sprinklers, which included compartments, which wouldn't have made any sense to me before then, but I think that was the context in which I asked Richard Howell, what does that mean? Flat sizes and wall thicknesses, I guess, and various other issues as well that the BRE was looking at. So I knew that was happening, and then a little later on, and I'm sure you'll ask about this, we approved external research in order to provide the evidence base for what would work in terms of a revision of Part B. I mean, I'm generally a believer in that policy is best if it's evidence-led, particularly in this sort of area.
Well, when you took on the brief to see the recommendations through, or rather to see the Secretary of State's promise through to the deadline, did you understand with any degree of precision what recommendations had been made by the coroner about the guidance in approved document B?
I think all I generally understood at the time was that again, this would have come from briefings, and as I say, not from reading in detail what the coroner had said, that there was a concern that the document wasn't clear enough, that people might misunderstand some of the requirements. So there was, I can't remember the exact phrase, but simplification of the language, and I took that to mean clarity of language rather than watering down of commitments.
Did you not want to see the letter and see the recommendations themselves, given that 6 people had died as a result of defects or apparent defects the coroner had pointed out?
Well, if I could put it to you this way, I could have spent an awful lot of time going back in time over what my previous predecessors as the ministers in this area, or what the Secretary of State had decided in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, but I'm not sure that would have made me more effective as a minister. I had lots of immediate issues in terms of building control and the other 5 areas of my responsibility to deal with. I don't think it was my role to go back and say, well, why are we responding in this way? The decision had been made. And I thought about this. As far as I'm aware, the coroner didn't come back and say the timescale is too long, or I'm not satisfied that you're dealing with my recommendations in a helpful manner. I don't believe so, but and if she did, I certainly didn't see it.
Now, we know that Eric Pickles responded to the coroner on the 20th of May.
Yes.
Did you read that letter when you took on this role?
Well, not when I took on this role, but I can't remember now whether I read that. It's possible I was shown that a couple of times when we were meeting the APPG or when we were dealing with the window installers. I can't be absolutely sure I was shown that letter, but obviously the quotes from that letter I saw many times, and I suppose the quotes from the letter were the salient points that I needed to understand, that the Secretary of State had not agreed to an immediate review of Part B, but had agreed to a review that would be delivered by 2016, 2017.
When you joined the department on the 7th of October 2013, were you briefed on the progress that the department had made in responding to the coroner's recommendations?
I don't think so, but as I said to you almost at the start of our session, there was a whirlwind of briefings about all sorts of issues in my first 6 weeks. There was one about building regulations in general. It would be wrong for me to say that I was specifically told about Part B. but I don't think it would have been in any detail. I mean, when those, you asked me about what I was told when I first became a minister in October 2013, at those stage, those were high-level, broad brush, if you like, briefings of the areas I would be dealing with, which there were many. So I don't think officials would have gone deep diving into particular issues about particular building regulations, particularly as, of course, there are other building regulations that things needed to be done in this time that I was going to be involved with.
What outstanding actions did you understand were left to be completed following the coroner's recommendations when you joined the department in October 2013?
I'm not sure I understood immediately, as I just said. I'm not sure I understood immediately in October 2013 what was outstanding or what needed to be initiated even at that point. I think most of my discussions around Part B, as are revealed in the documents that have been disclosed to the inquiry, were in the sort of the middle of 2014 to September 2014. So I don't think I was aware of it in October 2013 at all. So in terms of what was outstanding, it would have been initiating the process. And I was told that this had happened. As to what initiation means, preparatory work is underway, I think is the phrase in the submission that you've got as well. It's difficult for me to say, you sort of take that at face value. But shortly after that, I was told the BRE has been commissioned to look at these particular areas, including compartments, time of resistance to fire, and that's where it was explained to me about walls and fire doors and thickness of front doors and so on. We certainly went through all that at the time because I asked what did it mean. So in terms of what was outstanding, it was getting it underway. But as I've said to you, getting it underway and making progress, I guess, was my role in the process. But given the timetable that the Secretary of State had set out, it was never my role to complete the process.
Is that a convenient moment, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you. Well, you probably know, Mr. Williams, that we have a break during each of our sessions, and this is a good time to have the morning break, so we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12, and I have to ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you very much. 25 to 12 then, Mr. Phillips. Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Williams to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Williams, ready to carry on, I hope?
Yes, thank.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we please go to CLG 50671? This is a submission to you from Brian Martin, dated 25th November 2013, so just 6 weeks or so after you joined the department. Was this the first submission that you received about the Coroner's Rule 43 letter recommendations?
I believe so, yes.
What did you know about the Lachnal House fire before you saw this document?
Nothing whatsoever.
Looking at the heading, it says findings of a review of replacement window scheme guidance following the Lachnal House inquest. And if you look next at the text at 1, it says, following the inquest into the fire at Lachnal House, the Secretary of State commissioned a short review of guidance provided by the replacement window competent person scheme operators. This submission sets out the findings of that review and seeks your agreement for actions. Did you read this submission?
Yes, of course.
It asks you to agree to 4 actions, as you see under the recommendation, if we can scroll down. Those are 4 actions. Updating the competent person scheme. Yes, you can see that.
Yep.
And it asks you to agree to those recommendations. My question, were you ever made aware that the coroner didn't actually make any recommendation about the competent person scheme?
No, so to that, what you just said is quite surprising, given that this submission tells me that this is something we needed to do. Obviously, I'd been about a month in the post at that point. I would have taken that at face value.
Well, you wouldn't have done, would you, had you read the letter containing her recommendations?
That is true. That indeed is a fair point. But as you just said, this is probably the first submission I received from this particular official. Obviously, I've received lots of submissions about lots of other things by this stage. But it's telling me that the Secretary of State had agreed to do something in response to the coroner's letter, and we have done it. What else should I have thought? If it said we are minded not to do it, then obviously I would have had lots of questions, and it would have been quite reasonable for me to then say, well, how about, are we going about this in the right way? But that's not what it says, and I know, because I've reread the evidence that's been submitted to you, that I said I think it's important that we show that lessons have been learned.
Even the lessons that weren't drawn from the evidence by the coroner?
Well, I didn't know that, did I?
No. Let's go to page 2. Paragraph 5. On 28th of March, this is under the background, narrative verdicts were returned into the deaths at Lachnal House in Camberwell during what is widely regarded as the UK's worst tower block fire in July 2009. Much of the inquest focused on alterations that had been made to the building. This included work carried out by a window contractor that was registered with the Fencer Competent Persons Scheme. These schemes allow members to self-certify that work has been done in accordance with the building regulations. At the inquest, it was concluded that the scheme did not extend to all of the work and some of the work did not comply. The coroner recommended that the department review approved document B, fire safety, to improve its clarity and ease of use. The Secretary of State did not agree to an immediate review of ADB, but did commission a review of guidance issued by the competent person schemes for replacement window installers. Now let's look, in light of that, at the Rule 43 letter. Can we go to CLG 50401? There it is, 28th of March 2013. Take a moment to look at that document, please, Mr. Williams. It's addressed to Eric Pickles, and there's its first page. Do you remember when you first saw this document?
I think I've already said to you, I don't think I saw it at all.
No, but did you not even see it in writing your statements?
I may have, the original bundle of evidence for the inquiry was obviously now some time ago, and there was quite a lot, so I don't recall it.
Right.
I'm not going to pretend I do recall it. I don't, so I am looking at it.
Right. Let's go to page 3. We can see the heading in bold there, Building Regulations and Approved Document B. And I'll read it to you. During these inquests, we examined approved document B, 2000 edition, incorporating 2000 and 2002 amendments, ADB. I'm aware that ADB has subsequently been amended and believe that a further amendment is due to be published soon. The introduction to ADB states that it is, quotes, intended to provide guidance for some of the more common building situations, close quotes. However, ADB is a most difficult document to use. Further, it is necessary to refer to additional documents in order to find an answer to relatively straightforward questions concerning the fire protection properties of materials to be incorporated into the fabric of a building. And then we have the recommendations as follows. It is recommended that your department review ADB to ensure that it, and then there are 3 bullet points. Bullet point 1 provides clear guidance in relation to Regulation B4 of the Building Regulations, with particular regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building and the circumstances in which attention should be paid to whether proposed work might reduce existing fire protection. Bullet point 2 is expressed in words and adopts a format which are intelligible to the wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance and refurbishment of buildings, and not just to professionals who may already have a depth of knowledge of building regulations and building control matters. Bullet point 3 provides guidance which is of assistance to those involved in maintenance or refurbishment of older housing stock, and not only those engaged in design and construction of new buildings. Now, I've read those to you in full, and I hope slowly. Were you ever familiar with any of these recommendations here in these 3 bullet points during your time as Minister?
Not in those exact words, but I think I said to you in our first session this morning that it was my understanding, as explained to me by officials in the submissions that I had, that the coroner was concerned that the approved document was not sufficiently clear. So the revised document would be as much about clarity as being up to date, so that people could follow it. The people who were meant to follow it could follow it with certainty that they were doing what was required. So that was my understanding. And I don't think that's in any conflict with what's now in front of me.
Right. Now, you can see, because I can see, we can see it together, that there's nothing here about the Fencer competent person scheme, is there?
Not on the page
No.
extract I've got in front of me, no.
Now, did anybody explain to you that notwithstanding that the coroner had not referred to the Fencer scheme in her recommendations, nonetheless, the scheme was a response to an issue which had arisen in the course of the evidence at the inquest? Did anybody explain that to you?
Chairman, we didn't have a detailed conversation about the inquest in terms of what had been said, because, and I think that that is reasonable, because those conversations between ministers and officials would have happened six months earlier in formulating the response from the department to the coroner. My responsibility was, on the advice of officials, to implement what we could in my time as a minister based on what the coroner had recommended. Now, I think it is reasonable for me to say that if an official says we need to do X in response to what the coroner said, yes, I could have said, well, show me the letter so I can check you're telling me the truth, but I'm not sure that would have been reasonable behaviour by me, particularly as I say that this was, I think, from the date of when I had that submission about the Fencer scheme and the competent person scheme for window installers. I think I was 4 or 5 weeks into post. So it's unlikely that first discussion, I think that's probably the first time I met Brian Martin, that I'm going to say to him, how do I know you're telling me is correct? That I'm not sure that would have been reasonable for me to have done to him.
You say it's probably the first time I met Brian Martin. Did you have a meeting with him about this?
This is where, and I've seen, and it's actually referred to in my statement, where it's quite irritating that the department has not kept the actual submission documents that I saw and other ministers saw. I kept a red pen for all of my subs and wrote my comments on them, and quite, the most common thing I wrote was agreed or noted, because maybe that was all that was required. But if I needed to understand something, you would quite often ask a question, what does this mean? Or send the official to see me. And Whether I did that for this is now impossible for me to remember, and can't be advised either way because the original document was not retained, and that's frustrating for me, and I'm sure it's frustrating for you, Chairman.
Is the thrust of what you're telling us then that you received the document, read it, and took it at face value?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, let's move on to another document, CLG 402792, please. This is an email run in early December 2013. If we go, please, to page 2, we can see that on the 25th of November 2013, Brian Martin sends an email to your private secretary, copied to officials, including Bob Leadsom and Anthony Bird, and he has a summary there, timing and recommendation. And the recommendation mirrors what's in the sub. And then if we go up, please, to page 1, we can see the response from Kerr McKendrick in the second email in the chain there on the 4th of December 2013, saying, Brian, many thanks for this paper. As discussed yesterday, the Minister agrees with all your recommendations. He did want to reiterate that it was important this step should acknowledge the fact lessons have been learned.
Well, that's probably what I wrote on the sub, and that's why it's frustrating that the original is not available to you. But I'm quite glad that this email chain exists, which shows that I did read it and did comment upon it.
And this step, can you help us? What was that? What's the step? Can you remember that you...
Well, the step was dealing with what I thought was an issue with the competent person scheme for window installers that was required by the coroner. But I'm now hearing from you that the coroner didn't specifically ask the department to do that. But obviously I didn't know that. But I regarded it as an important step to showing that lessons had been learned from that fire, and the department was taking action.
What lessons?
That people who install windows should be competent to do so and should follow the technical guidance that they were meant to adhere to if they were a competent person. At this stage, this is November, December 2013, this is probably the first, well, not probably, it is the first time I would have heard the phrase competent person. It's not a phrase that a layman would use. And at that point, I was transitioning from being layman to being minister. So I probably did ask what is a competent person, and that's when I understood. A competent person could be the gas fitter, could be the electrical fitter, window installer, etc., etc. I hadn't fully appreciated that before.
And let's go up to the top email in the chain then, please, where we can see that Brian Martin sends the email chain on to other officials in the department, and he says, further to this, I've drafted the attached letter back to the CP scheme providers. Comments, please. Plan is to stir them up and see if they can't work it all out for themselves. B, and I don't know what that means. That might be an emoji, I don't know. Brian, now, neither you nor your private secretary are on the list of recipients. Can I take it that you never saw this email or were made aware of it?
No, I think we should make the general point here that ministers don't see emails in between officials or their private offices. They see the official document, that the submissions that we're talking about. So no, this is the first time I've seen this.
When you agreed to the recommendations set out for you by Brian Martin in his 25th of November submission, was it your understanding at the time that the aim of the recommendations you were being asked to approve was to stir up the competent persons scheme providers to, quote, see if they could work it out for themselves? Was that how you understood the idea?
But that leaving aside all the typos and so on, and that's not how I would have phrased it, no. But this is a colloquial email in between officials who probably sat almost at this, as far away from me as to you as we are at the moment. I don't know. My understanding was that the competent person scheme for window providers needed to be tightened up, and the department was going to tighten it up. But I wouldn't have understood this necessarily at the time, but in all of these schemes, there is a certain amount of self-regulation and self-certification that you have done the job correctly, or somebody within your organisation would certify that an apprentice or an assistant who is not officially a competent person, they certify that the work has been done. I didn't understand that at that point, but later on, because I asked about it, I did.
Did you ever follow up with Brian Martin or any other official on the scheme to make sure
No.
that it had been a success? No.
No, I didn't. But then I'm not sure why I would have done, because I've been asked to agree something. I did agree it. I think it's a reasonable assumption by me that they go away and do it. So this email is slightly surprising, but then I didn't know about it.
No. Were you ever aware that the Fence the Competent Persons scheme was never completed?
No. I wasn't aware then, and I'm not aware now that that's the case either.
Well, we take that from Brian Martin's witness statement at paragraph 35, but I think your answer is you were not aware.
No.
Now, going back to your first statement, if we can, please, paragraph 16, page 5, that's CLG 3030872. You can see there that the last sentence you say, I was involved in taking forward actions in response to the coroner's letter where related submissions were addressed to me for approval. Now, if we just go back then, please, to the coroner's Rule 43 letter, which is CLG 50401, page 3, and there it is, looking at the first bullet point, it says, it is recommended that your department review ADB to ensure that it provides clear guidance in relation to Regulation B4 of the building regulations with particular regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building and the circumstances in which attention should be paid to whether proposed work might reduce existing fire protection. Now, you didn't see this at the time,
No.
but did you have any understanding, given the role that you say in your statement that you had, namely to take forward actions in response to the coroner's letter, whether that recommendation had been rejected or accepted by the Secretary of State?
No. I mean, with hindsight, I think it's reasonable to say it would have been better if officials had given me a side-by-side explainer of this is what the coroner asked for and this is what we are doing next to them. I can see that now, but that wasn't given to me, and at the time, I didn't realise that the department might have been doing things that the coroner didn't ask them to do, or was perhaps taking time over some other aspects.
Right.
I wouldn't have known that, I say, in November 2013.
Right. And in November 2013, had you any clue, even, that the coroner had recommended that your department review ADB at all?
Yes, of course I had, because that is in the, that would have been explained to me in November 2013 when it was said that the window installers scheme needed to be revised. So I was aware that Lachnal had happened, though not the exact circumstances, that the coroner had made recommendations, and it was down to the department, and I presume possibly other people in government, to address her concerns and her recommendations. I'm sorry, that's quite general, but that general understanding is all I would have had at that point.
Now, if you had understood that the coroner had recommended that your department review ADB, what aspects of ADB did you think at the time the coroner had recommended be reviewed?
I think all I would have understood at the time, and again this is supported by the submissions, is that the main concern was clarity of the language in the document itself, that it was not easy to follow, and that should be addressed. I'm trying not to be rude about lawyers here. I don't know who drafts these documents, but quite often I can tell you as a minister and a parliamentarian, seeing clauses in bills, whether you're a minister or whether you're a shadow minister, as I had been in the previous parliament, quite often things are not written very clearly. And I'm a plain English person. I think official documents, whether they be acts of parliament or statutory instruments or the guidance that follows therefrom, really ought to be written in the clearest possible language with no ambiguity or caveat. So on that basis, what the coroner was saying would have chimed with me.
Well, you hadn't seen this letter at the time.
I hadn't seen the letter, no, we've established that.
So who told you that there was a problem with the clarity of the language in approved document B?
I think it says so in the submission that we looked at about 10 minutes ago.
Are you sure?
Well, I'm not sure now because it's not in front of me. So, but certainly in subsequent discussions, even if it's not in this November 2013 one, that quotation, whether it was a direct quotation or it's a summary quotation of the coroner's concern, it was repeated to me several times that there was concern that the document was not easy to follow in terms of what it currently said, and obviously an update would make sure that it reflected building practices at the time, so it was as up to date as possible, but also was as clear as possible.
Yes, I mean what the coroner recommended was that its clarity needed to be improved and to ease its use. Was there a discussion that you had with Brian Martin or any other official about that?
No, I mean, obviously a lot of what happens in these circumstances, Chairman, is that you might say with hindsight, with hindsight, I possibly could have said, please give me an example of something that is currently unclear in the document as currently drafted that might be misinterpreted by a building contractor or an engineer or an architect or whoever, but I didn't and we didn't.
Did anybody tell you that as a particular element of the clear guidance required, as you can see here from the first bullet point, particular regard had to be had to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building? Did anybody bring that to your attention in November 2013?
No, I don't think the phrase external envelope would have been used. I think it was just windows, which obviously are part of the external envelope, but this is again where you might actually say the language is not clear.
Well, what's not clear?
What external envelope means. I was told it was a problem with window installers, whereas external envelope could mean all sorts of things, but certainly would include windows.
In relation to clarity, then, what actions did you work on in taking forward?
Later on, and maybe we'll come to this submission, which would have been prompted probably by David Amos and Ronnie Knight asking for a meeting. I was told that the building research establishment had been commissioned to, and I wasn't involved in that commissioning, it had already happened. I assume that the officials maybe had delegated power to do that, or they already had budget from the previous year to do it. I don't know, but they had commissioned the building research establishment to look at several aspects that would help them prepare for the review of ADB, and that did include compartments, fire resistance, and sprinklers. That's what I recall at the moment.
Looking at the second bullet point, and I've read it before, if you look at it there, expressed in words and adopts a format which are intelligible to the wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance and refurbishment of buildings, and not just to professionals who may already have a depth of knowledge of building regulations and building control matters. Did you understand whether that recommendation had been rejected or accepted by the Secretary of State?
No, I didn't, but then it was the Secretary of State who is the head of the department, political head of the department, had made the response and had decided had made the response to the coroner and had decided what the scope of the department's work should be. And so those decisions had been made 6 months before I became a minister. So I was following through those decisions that had already been made by the Secretary of State. I don't think it was open to me to suspect there might be a need on my part to try and overturn that response.
No, but you hadn't read the letters we've established. What I'm seeking to understand is whether...
I hadn't read it because I wasn't shown it, yeah.
What I'm seeking to understand is whether your understanding was whether that recommendation, as I'm now showing you, had been agreed so that you were taking it forward, or rejected so you weren't.
Certainly language was referred to several times in the middle of 2014. I honestly cannot remember what discussion we had in November 2013, which was just about windows, whether it went to the wider requests that the coroner made. But certainly the midpoint of 2014, when the research was being commissioned and we were having discussions with David and Ronnie, then it was said to me that the coroner felt that the language was not clear enough.
Looking at the last recommendation, number 3, bullet point, provides guidance...
And that's a different issue, isn't it? The language in which the document is written is a different matter to the evidence that backs up the requirements that are in that document. So my involvement in this period was agreeing with officials that they would commission the relevant research to make sure that the document was up to date with what was going on in the building industry. As to how that document should then be written is the next stage. I never saw end to end. This may be part of the problem, Chairman, that you might reflect on, that no minister, including the Secretary of State, of course, in this case, saw from end to end what a revision of an approved document was. We were involved in parts of the critical path that would lead from we need to change to new document being issued, please everyone adhere to it. I was involved, I suppose, in the first, not at the first stage, but in the second stage that might have many subsequent stages to it, including the gathering of the evidence and then the cogitation on that evidence by officials and minister, then going out to consultation, then writing a document and getting it adopted by, well, not adopted by, but published so that industry could follow it.
Yes, I'm just seeking to get a feel, to understand in some detail what it was you were involved in by way of taking forward actions. So my question, I'll put it one more time, I hope more clearly. Looking at the second bullet point there, what actions were you involved in taking forward, using your language in your statement?
The actions that I would have taken were actions that I was asked to take. I mean, that is the engagement in between a minister and officials. Officials make a submission to a minister saying, you need to know this, or we need to do this, and we need to do it by this date, or whatever. Do you agree, or do you not agree, or do you need to know more? My understanding by the midpoint of 2014 was that the language in the existing approved document was not sufficiently clear, but it was not my job at that point to rewrite the language. That would come maybe a year down the tracks.
Looking at the third bullet point there, provides guidance which is of assistance to those involved in maintenance or refurbishment of older housing stock, and not only those engaged in design and construction of new buildings. Same question, what actions in respect to that recommendation were you involved in taking forward?
I know Chairman, it's a separate bullet point. I'm not entirely clear. It's a materially different point. It's again saying that these documents are of no use if people don't understand them, and they really ought to be written in intelligible language to everyone who is meant to use them in the course of their work. And just as importantly, I suppose, everyone who is meant to check that that work has been done in accordance with the document. And if the language isn't clear, then nobody is helped by it.
Other than a commitment to publishing a new edition of approved document B in 2016 to 17 that would be more easily understood, as is said, we've seen no mention in the documents that your department did anything more to address the coroner's concerns as set out in these 3 bullet points. from your knowledge or recollection, do you accept that?
No, because I've said to you a couple of times now that I was made aware that the building research establishment had been asked to work on several work streams in order to help the department address the coroner's concerns, and those we're probably going to come to it, but just to help you, I think those are in the lines to take comments of the submission for the meeting with David MS and Ronnie King, and I'm sure you're going to come to, which say what the BRE work streams were, and then later on there's the commissioning of work by other providers that was due to report. In fact, I know because I had to ask while preparing for this, because I never saw it, that that evidence reported back to the department, I think at the end of February 2015, so it would have been in the in-tray, as it were, of my successor.
In answering my question, you've referred to the BRE work streams. Did you think that those work streams were commissioned of the BRE in response to the Lachnal coroner's recommendations?
That was the impression I was given.
Was it? Were you not told that those had been commissioned before the inquest?
No. And you have obviously seen the same document as I saw, and I'm sure we'll come to it, that I was told these work streams are in progress, and they all seemed relevant to me to a rewording, redrafting of the approved document.
Was the wider question...
So no, Mr. Miller, I didn't know that work had been commissioned before the coroner's inquiry, but I think we can agree they certainly were helpful in addressing her concerns.
Well, I don't think you can attribute any such agreement to me. Was the wider question of the regulatory system and how it was working in practice ever discussed with you?
Can you sort of elaborate a little bit?
Yes. Was there any discussion that you had from November 2013 onwards with any of your officials about the building regulations, its architecture, its relationship with the approved documents, and how and whether it worked?
Whether they worked on the ground, you mean?
In practice?
There was, not directly in connection with approved document B, but I had far more conversations about delivering the zero carbon homes legislation, because that was something that had to be delivered, whatever, by March 2015. So I had lots of conversations with Richard Harrell and Bob Leadsom about that, and I do recall a conversation, something on the lines of course, you can regulate to say that you shall have triple glazing, you shall have well-insulated front doors and lofts and so on, but whatever regulations government put in place, that people don't always follow them, so there needs to be adequate monitoring that industry has kept up with what you're doing. And I do recall some reference to the fact that the way we build domestic properties in this country hasn't changed that much in the fundamentals of bricks and mortar and foundations and so on. And when you revise regulations, there's a whole process that needs to be gone through by the directors of house building companies, all the way down to a 16-year-old apprentice or an 18-year-old apprentice brickie, as to what they meant to do, and that should not be underestimated, of the sheer scope of what you're doing. The minister pulls a lever, but 1,000 other levers need to be pulled all the way down to the building site itself, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to be living in a warm home by 2016.
Who had functional oversight in your department about the timetabling and the progression of the responses to the recommendations of the coroner?
Functional oversight, well, I guess it would either be Bob Leadsom, who was, as I understood it, head of the Building Regulations Division, but I think I mentioned already the civil service is very hierarchical, and he would have had 2 or 3 people above him in the food chain in the department, including Peter Schofield. I cannot say, Chairman, how hands-on they were in making sure that Brian, I watched some of his evidence with you last week and the week before. I do not know how many fingers were on his shoulders to make sure that this work was being progressed. On the other hand, that is not a matter for me. That is a matter for the professional structure of the civil service.
How often was the progress of the coroner's recommendations reported to you? Was it regular, or was it just whenever you were given submissions? No,
it would have been whenever I was given submissions. There was not a what in business you might call a critical path analysis of the progress on it. And before you say that's unreasonable, which I guess you're going to, given the backstop date, that I know is somewhat fluid from the questions you've asked other people, but whether it was 31st December 2016, 31st March 2017, or whatever, but given that backstop date was quite a long way off in the future for a minister in the summer of 2014, I would not at that stage have expected to ring an alarm bell myself, or for officials to say to me, well, we're running into trouble here, whereas the department did track progress against quite a lot of things. I mentioned when you asked me how often did I interact with Eric Pickles that we had these Wednesday morning meetings called prayers, and at each of those meetings there was a tracking document for all sorts of things. What stage is a bill at, what stage is a statutory instrument at, what stage is a consultation at, and so on. But they were all things that were time critical for delivery by that government during the life of that government. I don't think, well, I assume it's in the scope of the inquiry to ask for a copy of that document, which was refreshed every week. I don't think this sort of thing would have been on it, because the critical time was not up until March 2015. It would have been during 2016, the remainder of 2015 and at some point in early 2016.
Was the progress of the coroner's recommendations ever discussed at these prayer meetings, Wednesday morning meetings?
No, I don't. I honestly don't think so. But given that there were probably 80 of them in the time I was a minister, I mean, I can't definitively say they were never discussed, but I don't think they were, for the reasons I've just given. Whereas certainly from December 2014 onwards, there was increasing anxiety amongst ministers and department heads that government's time was running out and statutory instruments need to be written. I'm afraid the lawyers got a lot of stick for not writing them on time and so on. And we were very concerned. So the department did have a tracking mechanism. Ministers were involved in discussing that tracking mechanism, but it was for things that were time critical within the next week, the next quarter, or perhaps the next 6 months. This revision of Part B, given the dates that were committed to by the Secretary of State, was not considered critically at risk, I guess, during the time that I was a minister.
What did you understand by 2016, 2017?
Yeah, Chairman, I've seen the questions. I've seen you referring, Mr. Miller, to Melanie Dawes' answer.
No, sorry. I'll ask the question again. What did you understand? What did you think it meant?
I understood it to mean 31st of March 2017 at the latest. I now understand from what other people have said in evidence to you that may have been an erroneous assumption, but that's what I thought it meant.
Do you know that there was, or did you think that there was a proper system of recording which of these recommendations had been accepted, which had been rejected, or which had been half and half by the Secretary of State?
No, I didn't. I didn't ask. I think I've already said to you that with hindsight, it would have been beneficial to me to have had a single page of side-by-side comparison. But if that existed, it was not shown to me. I can't tell you whether it existed, only the officials could tell you whether it existed.
I'm going to turn to a different topic, international cladding fires. Now, in the period 2013 to 15, while you were Parliamentary Under-Secretary at the department, were you aware of a spate of high-rise fires in the UAE?
No.
So can we take it that you hadn't heard of fires in Sharjah in 2012 or in Dubai in October 2012 or in Sharjah again in April 2013?
The short answer is no. I mean, I'm a news hound. And I'm not parochial. I do take an interest in what's going on outside this country and outside Europe even, but I'm afraid I was not aware of those particular incidents, and I was not made aware of those particular incidents either.
Right. And what about the fire in the Crosse building in Melbourne on the 25th of November 2014?
No.
Did you get to hear about that? No. And what about the fire at the Torch skyscraper in Dubai in February 2015?
No, I can help you by saying I have no recollection of international examples of fires being brought to my attention at any point.
Right. Did you make any inquiries yourself or ask anybody in your department about whether there were risks to high-rise buildings here in the UK as a result of any overseas fires? Presumably not.
No, but given I wasn't aware that those incidences you've just listed had happened, then it's not a question I would have asked. So I was aware that Lachnal had happened, or I've been made aware that Lachnal had happened, which was a spread from one flat to another. But I was also told that was unusual, extraordinarily unusual, in fact, in this country. And the British government's responsibility, or the Westminster government's responsibility under devolution, is for regulations in this country. While I think evidence from abroad is obviously useful, it's not our responsibility. So I wasn't made aware of any of those, and I had no reason to ask whether other countries have worse incidents than we have, which seems to be what you're describing.
Did you expect your officials to have kept you appraised of any relevant matters of concern, any relevant issues that were being experienced by the building industry if they related to life safety?
I would have had that expectation, and I have no reason to believe that they weren't. Yes, I did mention earlier electrical safety and the competing competent persons verification schemes in that area. We did have a discussion about why fires start, and the most common cause, I think, was electrical failure. And this was the concern of the select committee that scrutinised, the statutory select committee that scrutinises the department's work. And I was grilled about that. Given what you've just asked me a couple of questions ago, I suppose it's surprising that those international incidents were not brought out in those formal evidence sessions, but they weren't. So I guess nobody was aware officially that they'd happened. But nonetheless, the risk from poor electrical work causing a fire was certainly discussed, and we had a general discussion about why the incidence of fire breaking out has declined over time, and regulation is a key part of that in terms of furniture design, television design. That television will switch off automatically after a few hours if you don't engage with it, and so on. And all of those regulatory changes have contributed to the reduction in the breakout of fire. So certainly that discussion was had.
So you did have discussions about the statistics showing the relative decline of fire deaths, is that right?
Yes, there was a discussion about it. I think that would have been in advance of the meeting with David Amos and Ronnie King. I remember my own contribution to that, because for 3 years prior to being a minister, I was chair of the all-party group on smoking in public health, and as well as electrical faults decreasing over time because of technical requirements on lots of things in the home, that cigarette smoking incidence has declined from, I'm guessing, the age of all of us here, sir, has declined from probably 60% of the adult population in the 1980s to less than a fifth now in England. And very few fires are now started by people falling asleep in bed or the armchair with a fag in their fingers. So lots of things have contributed to the decline in fires. And as a liberal interventionist, I said to you earlier, I think regulation has an important, and Parliament has an important role in making sure that that trend continues.
Did you get the sense at any time from your discussion with officials on the question of statistics that they regarded that as a good sign, which meant that perhaps they were overlooking things, particularly in relation to the severity of individual events?
Well, there's a value judgment in the middle of that question.
Yes, did you make that value judgment?
I took at face value, and I had no reason to contradict them, that the incidence of fires in terms of the number of outbreaks had declined over time, and for reasons that I've just said. We did not have a discussion that amongst that reduced number, the severity of the fire might be worse. Sorry, is that clear?
Was there any discussion at any time you can recall about whether the 6 deaths at Lachnal fell within the statistical expectation?
It's an odd question. I'm not sure that there is a statistical expectation of the number of deaths that are expected or reasonable from fire. I would have thought if there was a statistical expectation, it should be 0.
Well, within the norm.
No, it certainly wasn't in the norm. I mean, certainly as I say, in the brief conversation I had about Lachnal House on 2 occasions, that it was said to me that this was an extraordinary event, should not have happened, and because it happened in 2009, and leaving aside the international examples you've given, it had not happened in the intervening years since 2009 to 2014, when I would have been having these discussions. And I was aware that fires break out in tower blocks and don't usually spread. My constituency, Bristol West, has, I think, at least a dozen tower blocks in it, and I'd been the councillor for the city centre, where most of them are, before I was a member of Parliament. There isn't a door I haven't knocked on, or a landing I haven't walked along in those tower blocks in the last 30 years, and fires did occasionally break out, but they never spread, including one actually did break out in the time I was a minister. Difficulty saying this word, compartmentation worked in all of those examples. That is why Grenfell is just so horrifying.
I want to turn to the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group. Can we start, please, with the statement of Eric Pickles at CLG 30199471, and go to page 24 in that document, paragraph 82. And in the middle of the page, he says this: I've subsequently been shown correspondence received by the department from the All-Party Parliamentary Fire and Rescue Safety Group, which was dealt with at the junior minister level. I did not see this correspondence at the time or the responses the department sent. I'm disappointed to see that the convention of politeness in interministerial correspondence was not always adhered to. That's his view. Looking back on your time as Parliamentary Undersecretary, would you agree?
The convention of politeness on politicians communicating with each other, I would say I'm at the polite end of the scale. You're going to question Mr. Pickles shortly, I believe. I think he's perhaps further along the scale of impoliteness than I am. So I don't know who he's referring to. He doesn't say, does he? And the APPG, as I know, had correspondence with lots of ministers before my time, after my time, and at the same time, because there were 2 fire ministers that coexisted with me in the department. So I don't know who he's referring to there. But I'm a well-brought-up person. I like to be polite. But politicians can sometimes be direct and blunt to each other in a way that other people might think is not the way you should speak to each other. But then I guess we're more thick-skinned than some other people, or some other people reading it later on.
Now, I'm not going to go through all the correspondence with the APPG. Just to be clear about one or two things, I think you'll agree the late Sir David Amis, MP, was the group's chairman.
Yes.
And Ronnie King, OBE, their honorary secretary. Yes?
That's correct.
Those are two individuals that I think you can agree you know about. Now, I'm not going to go through all the correspondence, but it's right, I think, isn't it, that in the first part of 2014, you received letters from both Ronnie King and Sir David Amis on the subject of sprinklers, the subject of research by the BRE, the Lachnal inquest, and the proposed review of ADB.
Yes.
Yes. Now, let's look at the first of the letters. 1st of May 2014, from Sir David Amis, CLG 3019248. And there it is, and it's addressed to you as the Minister, and in the first paragraph it refers to previous correspondence between you and Ronnie King, and if you look at the start of the second paragraph, it discusses research which the group believed showed the benefit of sprinklers. What I want to do is look at the second part of the second paragraph, halfway down, and it's a sentence which starts, Mr. King. Can you see that on the left?
Mr. King also referred.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mr. King also referred in his correspondence to his personal involvement with the Lachnal House Coroner's inquest last year, where clarification was given from your department that the current building regulations allowed the composite panels under the external wall window sets of such tower blocks not to have any fire resistance, and that this weakness in the regulations remains uncorrected today, despite the upward spread of fire which occurred, resulting in the deaths of 6 people. Now, my first question, did you read this letter at the time?
That's difficult for me to say definitively yes or no to, Chairman, simply because I think in my first session this morning I probably gave you a lot of context about how I worked and how the office worked. I'm trying not to do that again now, but the volume of correspondence that I dealt with, you shouldn't underestimate how considerable it was. And letters that go out in my name, either as a minister, in this case, or as a member of Parliament, which of course I still was, are drafted by colleagues, and usually what you would see would be the reply rather than the incoming, as it were. And you have to trust your colleagues that they have addressed the points that come through. Otherwise, you would simply grind to a halt. I mean, when I say volume, I'm talking hundreds a week.
Does that tell us that, although you might sign the replies to letters such as these, you didn't actually necessarily always see the letters themselves?
That is true. It's not to say I never saw the incoming letter or asked to see the incoming letter, but you should not assume, either from me or any other minister, or indeed an MP generally, who of course are parliamentary researchers to draft all their correspondence, that you see and read everything that comes in, because you don't. That's just simply not how the system works.
Right.
So some of the letters that don't assume that I automatically signed every single letter and gave no thought to them. I definitely don't want you to think that. But I couldn't question the veracity of every single letter in front of me because you couldn't do that, given you're also dealing with submissions, parliamentary questions, oral questions, delegations, etc. And most of my letters were signed on the move. I was a minister that didn't want to sit behind the desk. I got out of the department at least twice a week, and most of my correspondence was signed in the back of a car on the way to a visit, if he was in London, or on a train. If he was somewhere else, then the private secretary who was accompanying me on that visit would hand me the letter. I would read it, would sign it, hand it back to the official who put it in the folder, who put it back in the bag, and that's the process.
Well, forgive me, because I had understood, and maybe this is wrong, that when an MP who was chairman of an all-parliamentary committee wrote to the minister would read the letter. But is that, I've got that wrong, have I?
I wouldn't say you've got it absolutely 100% wrong. I'm just saying to you, I cannot give you the assurance that I read the incoming correspondence to which a reply was going out in my name, because if I did that, I would be misleading you. And so I'm just honestly telling you that routinely you did not read the incoming correspondence, you read the reply. Right. If you were suspicious that the reply was defective, then you could, it was open to me to reject it. Quite often I did rewrite letters because they were badly written, but that's another issue.
But should we understand that even letters from an all-party parliamentary group might not be seen by a minister, even though he signed the response?
Yes. I don't know whether you, Chairman, I don't know whether you've covered this with previous witnesses, what the status for an APPG is.
I think we have been told. But
yeah, they're not bodies to which ministers are accountable. I think this is what you may be getting at, correct me if I'm wrong. Ministers are accountable to the select committee. They're accountable to Parliament, where you answer oral questions or written questions. They are not accountable to an all-party group, which is a self-selected group of people.
I think I understand.
So
the question,
so the weight,
but they are written.
Different.
Sorry, forgive me. They are. The letter does come from a body of MPs, and therefore, I assume, is regarded as having been written by that group of MPs. And I had thought, perhaps wrongly, that in general, correspondence from MPs would be read by the minister, but may not be the case. I don't know.
No, because no, it isn't the case, because
right.
David would not have been the only member of Parliament writing to me or indeed other ministers in the department about all sorts of things. I think the rule would have been that a letter from an MP, a fellow MP, or indeed a member of the House of Lords or default administration gets a response from the minister, was quite a lot of other correspondence. I don't know, the department can tell you what the volume of incoming was, but quite a lot of other correspondence may have been dealt with directly by an official. But yes, the expectation would be that a letter from an MP would get a response directly from the minister, but doesn't necessarily mean that you read everything that came in from them.
All right, but then in that case, how were you able to be confident that the draft reply, which you were, or the reply that you were being asked to sign, did actually engage with the contents of the letter that had been written to you?
I think the best way for me to answer that is to say there's an element of trust issue there, that if an official who by that stage I'd met, got the feel of, has written a response on your behalf. None of these letters are written by either the MP in terms of constituency correspondence or the minister. They're all originated by someone else. You have to trust them that they have addressed the issues that you're being asked to put your name to. And that was the position I was in. And as I said, given that I was signing letters on umpteen other things at the time, sometimes the judgment that was in the letter I didn't like, but that's because there was some more political latitude. If there was an issue about how you deal with race equality or chanting in football grounds, which are real examples, I'm not making them up, I could take a view on. But where an official was responding to a letter on a technical issue where he was the expert and I was the layman, then I had to give more trust to that individual, that the response was adequate.
Yes.
Otherwise, we don't get anywhere, because couldn't have second-guessed everything that was being put in front of me.
I understand. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Chair.
Mr. Williams.
Well, looking at this letter, does it fall within the perhaps minority of cases where you did read it? Just looking at what I've shown you. Have you any recollection of what I'm showing you?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
All right. Look at the last paragraph on the page. It says, the group is at a loss to understand how this delay to review these life safety measures can be left unaddressed until 2016 to 17, despite your reference to government-published guidance on regulatory policy via the Better Regulation Executive's webpage. Now,
I don't remember that paragraph, but I do remember discussing with officials that the primary concern of the APG was, if you like, the timeliness of the review, that 2016, 2017, however it's defined, was too far off into the future, and a swifter redrafting of the document was required. But what officials said to me to counter that was that don't underestimate the level of work that needs to be done to revise an approved document. I think there is a phrase in a submission that I've read, and no doubt you have as well, which says these things cannot be done overnight. And David's expectation was that this thing could be done quickly. He was never clear about what his revised timetable should be, whether it should be 31st December 2016 or 1st of July 2016. He was never clear on what quicker meant, but officials were clear with me that at that stage, where I was involved, there was no scope for speeding things up because we were in the evidence gathering stage. There may have been scope for speeding things up later once you've got the evidence, but that's for you to ask my successors about. But at this stage, there was no scope for a speeding up.
have you finished?
Yes.
Because I haven't actually asked you a question yet.
Oh, sorry, I thought you had.
No, I just put the paragraph to you. And my question is, this is the 1st of May 2014. Is this paragraph the first time that you were alerted to the fact that this committee was concerned about the delay to review of what it calls life safety measures being left unaddressed until 2016 to 17?
It would, yes. Well, sorry, I preempted your question by saying yes, around about this time, because I think the request for a meeting comes in within a week or so of this. That was a concern that David Amos and Ronnie King had, that the government was not responding quickly enough, as far as they were concerned.
And they characterised these measures as life safety measures. Did you understand at this time that what they were concerned about was a delay to a review of life safety measures?
Yes, but I didn't get involved in all of the approved documents. As we know, there are quite a lot of them covering different areas, but I think most of them, you could say, are concerned with life safety, whether it's the risk of falls and accidents or the risk of faulty electrical work breaking out. So I'm not sure it's fair to characterise them as in a hierarchy, which I think is what you're trying to do, saying that Part B is more important than Part K or Part P or whatever. I didn't see them in that light, and no one told me that some are more important than others. So I think they all, or certainly most of them, are due to the personal safety of residents or visitors or prisoners or hotel stayers or work, people in their workplace. That's why all of them are there.
Now let's look at the response. Can we go to that, please? It's at CLG 3019249, please. And I'm so sorry, I should have shown you, we don't need to go back to it, but the letter ends with an invitation to you to meet with the group on the 17th of June 2014.
Oh, right. So when I said simultaneously, in fact, it was simultaneously, yeah.
Now, let's look at this response. We can see that your name is at the bottom and there's a signature. Is that your signature?
Yes.
So can we take it that you read this letter at the time before you signed it?
Yes, absolutely. While we've established I didn't necessarily read the background material to a reply, I certainly read the replies.
Let's look at it. Thank you for your letter of 1st of May in response to my letter to Mr. King, the Honorary Administrative Secretary of the All-Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group, regarding the group's calls for a revision to approved Document B to the building regulations. So just to be clear, you're thanking him for a letter you hadn't read, or might not have read, in accordance with your practice.
Well, again, this is a letter written by an official, almost certainly Brian, who you saw last week.
Right.
And again, it's a letter about the timing. And I already knew that the timing was a concern that they had. Whether it was because I read the letter or whether it was because I'd been told, that was one of their concerns. The other mainly being about installing sprinklers in buildings.
When you signed this letter, did you have in front of you at least your own letter to Ronnie King, Mr. King, to which Sir David Amos's letter was the 1st of May response?
No, because that again wouldn't have been the way the office worked.
Now,
I'm taking this reply on face value, at face value, and I'm signing it in that way.
right.
It says I'll be happy to meet him. I don't know now whether this is before or after the original request for a meeting was rejected, which I ended up overturning.
Well, we'll come to that. But looking at the second paragraph, you say this. In your letter, you say that the group does not understand why a review is being left until 2016 to 17. Perhaps I've not made myself clear. We expect a revised document to be published around that time. Preliminary work leading to that publication has in fact already started. A review of such an important document is a significant activity and covers a wide range of complex issues and conflicting views. As I said in my letter to Mr. King, what I'm not willing to do is bring this programme of work forward. And then you go on to say, I will of course be happy to meet with the all-party group where my diary permits.
Yeah.
Who drafted this letter?
Well, that I don't know, and I don't know now, and I'm not sure I would have known then. My assumption is it was Brian Martin, and as in any professional office, I assume if he drafted a letter, it would have been authorised by someone the grade where civil service works in the grade above him, which either would have been Richard Harrell or Bob Ledson. But I don't know.
When it was handed to you, what did you make of the tone of that middle paragraph to which you were being asked to put your name?
I can't. It's not possible for me now to know what I thought about the tone of this letter or other letters at the time. But other than, I knew David Amos, and despite the fact we didn't agree on much as MPs in the same coalition government, he gets a friendly sign-off from me rather than a "yours sincerely, Stephen Williams," which other people might have got. So on my part, there's no animus intended. Perhaps I have not made myself clear. It's not something that, if I'd been writing the letter personally, or if it was going to a constituent, that word would not have left the building. But it wasn't. I hadn't written a letter. It was an official letter that I'm signing. It's going to another member of Parliament whose feelings aren't necessarily something I need to worry about. But it does say, and it reiterates, and we've gone over this ground, that preliminary work has started, and what I wasn't able to do was to bring forward the end date, and that's one of the issues I've thought about. Could I have challenged officials to say, why 2017? Why not end 2016, mid 2016, whatever? But I was told there's a process to be gone through. It is a convoluted and long one, and given that my time in office was due to end almost to the day a year after this letter, my ability to influence things was getting the evidence in at that point, which was done. I'm sure we're going to come to that, but that was done.
Would you agree that the middle paragraph of that letter discloses barely concealed irritation with the APPG?
Well, this is where we get to the issue that I'm not the person who wrote the letter. I don't. It is impossible for me to know where I was at the point of signing that letter. As I explained to you, it's quite possible he was in a waiting room in Wolverhampton railway station or something, that I was signing lots of letters and quickly handing them back to the official. That there clearly is an expression of irritation, but it wasn't necessarily mine.
Well, if it wasn't yours, why did you put your name to the bottom of it?
Well, because these aren't personal letters, Mr. Millett. They're not friendly notes between colleagues. They are official correspondence from, they're corporate correspondence, if you like, from a government minister to another parliamentarian.
What difference does that make?
They're not. I did say to you earlier, if this was a letter to Mr. David Amos, who lived in Bristol West, that letter would have had a big red line through it. But that's not what these letters are. A minister is replying in a corporate sense on behalf of an organisation, the government. It's not. You should not interpret personal feelings from it, because that's not what they are. And I've said to you that David and I were totally different people in terms of our political values, but we actually liked. I like to think we liked each other. I certainly liked him, and we got on, and we knew each other. And that's why I know you're going to come to this. That's why he got his meeting, because he came up to me and said, "I'm disappointed that your officials have told you not to meet with me. Can we have the meeting?" And I said, "Well, yes, okay. Let's hear what you have to say."
Given that you hadn't read or may not have read the letter to which this letter you were signing was a response, did you not ask yourself or the official who'd handed it to you for signature what it was that the 1st of May letter had misunderstood?
Well, the second paragraph says you may have misunderstood, and this is what you should understand, that preliminary work is underway. I think possibly, thinking back on it, that David and Ronnie King were under the impression the department was not moving with sufficient alacrity to address this issue. Officials felt they were moving at the required speed to deliver the document by the required date. The end date. The end date was not set by me. It was something that was in place and had gone through a process 6 months before I became a minister. So I wasn't able to twiddle the end date. All I was able to do was to make sure that by the time I left office, we'd made good progress on having a fighting chance of meeting that end date.
Let me try it slightly differently. The sentence, perhaps I've not made myself clear. We expect a revised document to be published around that time. Now, before you signed off on that sentence and its tone, did it not occur to you that you might like to acquaint yourself with precisely what it was that Mr. Sir David had said, which justified that sentence?
Possibly, and as I've said to you a couple of times now, it's impossible for me to know now whether there was a discussion about this letter. I've been open with you by saying the chances are there wasn't a discussion about it, simply because of the sheer volume of correspondence across a range of issues that I would have been signing off, along with lots of other things at the same time. The thought process that you go through when your private secretaries are saying, agree this, look at that, is necessarily limited.
Did you ever think that to publish a new version of approved document B, 3 or even 4 years after the coroner had recommended it be updated, even if only to be simplified, and the best part of 8 years after 6 people had died, was frustrating for
Yes.
the APPG?
Yes, I did. I did understand that at the time. It's not a retrospective hindsight understanding. I did feel that David was making some reasonable points, which is why I told officials I want to hear what he has to say, because I felt he did have some reasonable points about timescale and Ronnie King in particular had a long-standing issue about installing sprinklers in builds. And I wanted to hear it. When you asked in one of the earlier questions this morning, did you ever challenge officials? Well, actually, on this issue, I did. I said, I want to hear what they have to say.
Yes. Now, David Amos, as I've shown you, raised concerns over composite panels, the lack of fire resistance in component parts, and weaknesses in the building regulations, and external fire spread. Did you have a view, when you signed this letter, about those concerns, about whether they were genuine and well-founded, or about whether they were illegitimate and baseless?
Well, those are two extremes, aren't they?
Or somewhere between the two extremes.
I would say it was somewhere in between. Ministers have lots of people trying to influence them. They have fellow parliamentarians trying to influence them, sometimes in competing directions. They have lobbyists who come to see them. They have constituents who come to see them. And you have to weigh up, how much weight do you give to this person as against to that person? This is an area where I was not the expert on other issues. I felt I was more expert sometimes than the officials, given that they changed quite often. But in this area, I was not the expert. I was relying on people who not only held themselves out to be the experts, but had demonstrated to me by this stage that they had been in those positions for some time, knew the issues inside out, and were giving me the appropriate advice. And with hindsight, I'd like to say to you, I should have second-guessed them, I should have repeatedly challenged them. But I put it to you, if that was the case, I couldn't have done my job. At some point, ministers have to take at face value and trust the opinions being given to them by their officials, and that's who you should give the most weight to. Yes, there are challenging opinions from outside, and David Amos and Ronnie King were one of them, and I did listen to them, but ultimately, I think we'd be having a more fierce exchange at this point, Chairman, if you were asking me why I'd ignored the advice of officials who were employed by the government to advise ministers. Was in fact I followed their advice.
Forgive me, but this isn't advice, is it? Other than that, it's a suggested response that you should sign in response to a letter they hadn't shown you. So,
well, it's not advice. No, it's a letter. It's a letter that contains facts, and facts that are relevant. That says, while you, David, have concerns that the review has been left until 2016, 2017, which he incidentally never queried the detail over what that meant or what he thought the alternative meaning should be. That conversation certainly never took place. But given that they had a concern that it wasn't being done quickly then, that the letter is giving factual information that work is underway. And in 2014, what else would you expect for there to be work underway? Certainly, you could not conclude the work anytime soon from 2014, in the next 6 months or whatever.
the letter I showed you, the letter I showed you contained a number of things, not least about external fire spread and approved document B. You don't know, because you didn't read it, that this letter wasn't addressing those concerns. Do you?
Well, that is true. Well, I think what I said to you is it is impossible for me to say to you that I've read it because I cannot. It's impossible for me, eight years on, to know whether I read an incoming piece of correspondence. Obviously, I read the replies in every single circumstance, but I cannot be sure that I knew what the response was addressing. Not sure how more open I can be about that.
Does that explain why you address none of those matters in this letter? You hadn't been shown it.
from what you're saying, I don't think it doesn't address any of the letters, the issues in the incoming letter. It does address the timetable, and I had been told that and the issue about sprinklers was the main concern of David Amos and Ronnie King. And although sprinklers aren't mentioned in this letter, the timetable is.
Mr. Chairman, we're going to turn to a different topic, just a little bit further on in the chronology. I'm happy to start it now.
Well, I wonder if that's wise. We've only got 2.5 minutes
Well, quite.
on the clock. I think we'd be best to start a fresh topic when we've all had some refreshment.
Very good.
Yes. Mr. Williams, I think it's better we stop for lunch now, so we'll break. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And again, I have to ask you, please, don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room. All
I have
right?
my sandwich ready in the room.
Well done. Thank you. Off you go with the usher then, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 2 o'clock then, please.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.